And our next speaker is Dermot King, who's the current director of Ballymun Youth Action Project, and he's going to talk to the topic of communities and recovery. Thanks, Dermot.
Okay, so thank you very much, and again, thanks to everybody for participating in the webinar this morning, and for taking the time out to join us in this what we see as a very crucial conversation. Hilda mentioned there, and David emphasised too, the importance of people in recovery accessing the community. That's as a resource. That's a key part of the equation. And I suppose the concern that we're aware of is what happens in those communities, and where are those communities, our communities, in that process. So the focus of my presentation really is to look at the community and where the community is in that. So a key insight in the very early days of the Ballymun Youth Action Project was noticing that individuals, families and communities, they all seem to be travelling in the same direction on similar journeys when it came to substance use and its impact. The simple pattern at the time was don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, originally identified by Claudia Black in her book, It'll Never Happen to Me, was seen to be shared not just by individuals and families, but also by the community itself, when substance use reached a certain kind of critical threshold. 40 years on, we can articulate clearer understandings about change at the individual level, and again, David has really shown that very clearly, and at the family level. But we still struggle to come up with coherent understandings of what's happening for communities. Again, David has talked a bit about this, but some argue that making problematic drug and alcohol use a medical issue, while it reduces stigma and has increased treatment expertise, that it's also created an unhelpful separation between individuals and their communities. There's also growing recognition that addressing substance use in isolation as an individual issue is quite inadequate as a model of change, and indeed as a model of recovery. Again, the whole idea of recovery capital that David has mentioned there, and this recognition of the importance of a broader frame is also developed very, very well in a lot of the work on ecosystemic approaches, on collective impact, and even 2 years ago, the National Drug Conference was on the topic of inclusion health. So there's a growing recognition of the importance of moving beyond that individual frame. And at the same time, it's clearly very difficult to hear and to acknowledge the suffering of communities impacted by severe and prolonged substance use. For communities themselves, it can feel like a hopeless treadmill, and it's made worse when the impact passes from one generation to the next. Marianne and Hilda, their study on community indicators in 2006, and Citywide's conference report in 2013 titled Drugs Can We Take Anymore? And again, almost any current investigative reporting, they all clearly identify what is the severe impact of prolonged use on communities. You want to put up the next slide? The most obvious impacts are social nuisance, loss of public space, perceptions around lack of community safety and increased crime, and increased levels of intimidation and fear. Then the impact on individuals and families, and the health and relational losses linked with this, including drug-related deaths. And finally, the familiarity and normality of drug use and drug dealing undermines the fundamental structures and identity of communities, pulling apart social and community resources. William White, again mentioned by David, describes that many communities feel what they feel as distress, where the demands of community adaptation exceed the collective coping capacity. In these circumstances, problems can become contagious, and people feel stuck, frustrated, powerless, and hopeless. Trauma becomes a reality in these situations and can further lead to the deactivation of resources that otherwise might be available. Today's webinar is about communities into recovery. So I've just sketched what's happening for communities impacted by drug and alcohol use. So what does into recovery mean? The earliest use of the word into is in two sentences in around the 12th century. And the sentences are into the house and into an alliance. Now our understanding includes the notion of roots, of movement, of change, of difference. Into is also about being captivated by something, being enthused, being sold on it. So can we say something about communities into recovery? Can we put the next slide? William White offers the following definition of recovery. Recovery is the experience through which individuals, families, and communities impacted by severe alcohol and other drug problems utilize internal and external resources to voluntarily resolve these problems, to heal the wounds inflicted by alcohol and other drug-related problems, actively manage their continued vulnerability to such problems, and develop a healthy, productive, and meaningful life. He goes further. In terms of community recovery, adding how it enhances intergenerational resilience and clarifying that is more than the personal recovery of community members. It involves strengthening the connective tissues between those with and without such problems, while restoring and sustaining the quality of community life. There's a Native American metaphor, again used, that powerfully captures this, and it's that of the healing forest. If individuals struggling with substance use are seen as struggling trees in an already challenged forest, the solution is ultimately not to take the person out of the forest and fix them and put them back, but to treat the soil, to heal the forest itself, within which all trees can then be healthy. Development work uses a similar metaphor, that of pulling bodies out of the river, when the real need is to go up the river and to find why people are falling or being pushed into the river in the first place. So if these are reasonable pictures of the goal of communities into recovery, what might facilitate getting there? Again, to guide us in this, there was a piece of work, a substantial piece of work done in Philadelphia, looking at system transformation and community mobilization. And they identified strategies that actually work in supporting this journey into community recovery. I'm just going to outline some of the key strategies that were identified there. Open on the next slide. So on the left-hand side, I suppose, are some of the strategies. There are more there and more detail given. And on the right is the rationale behind why we would do that. The first one is to listen and to engage people from throughout the community. The rationale being that people in distressed communities, they need opportunities to share their struggles and to experience being heard and understood. Personal and collective healing can occur through seeing one's personal story as part of a larger story, and to allow movement from an I story to a we story. A second strategy is to open up closed systems. Distress generates isolation. It just creates an us versus them thinking. It closes down boundaries and relationships. Opening up those systems, being transparent, again, challenges all of that. The next one is to forge or strengthen old and new partnerships. A word that's used sometimes is de-siloization, the idea that each little container does its thing, but to break those down and build new connections. Because distressed communities normally suffer from problem synergy, where each problem only serves to magnify other problems rather than allow them to be dealt with. The next one is to create synergistic effects through integrated and linked projects. Again, community recovery requires decreasing the distance between the location of problems and the location of solutions. And again, a very simple example of this, say in Ballymun, has been the co-location of the GP counselling project in a primary care practice. That was, again, ways of creating synergies at a local level, making a difference and reducing distance. Next slide there. The next set are to strengthen natural supports beyond the professional service systems. And again, David has teased this out a bit, and Mary Ellen showed how from the start of YAP's own experience, this has been the reality. Community recovery, in community recovery, the first line of recovery support is the community itself. And in a way that professional treatment is the safety net. The next one is the promotion of tolerance, respect, and mutual support. Because intolerance, stigma, and intergroup conflict, they're symptoms of community distress. The most effective stigma reduction strategy is a relational contact strategy. So for stigma to change, intolerance to increase, people need to meet to connect. The last one is the second last one is to inspire hope. Recovery initiative hinges on changing prevailing pessimism, holding up the idea that personal, family, and community recovery is both possible and a growing reality. As was said earlier, often the communities themselves, our communities, experience things as being intractable, unchangeable, ongoing, just constantly rolling over. So the challenge to inspire hope in those situations and settings. And finally, the need to increase trust. Exploitation and abandonment is often the norm in distressed communities. Community engagement thus requires a period of testing, of trust building, and a continuity of presence over time. Again, just as David mentioned, in terms of the kind of cyclical and the nature of recovery, the journey is things will shift and go back and go forward and go back. And equally, the development of trust in those circumstances, we talk about it often, but for communities, there's a very similar experience. So these strategies in the context of building social capital have already a proven efficacy. However, there are multiple pathways and styles for implementing them. There must be a community and a cultural fit, which itself taps into the cultural capital and then allows the creation of meaningful metaphors for a community into recovery. So you can put on the last slide there. So we're talking about systems changing, recognizing the weaving of impact created by multiple organizations, statutory providers, neighborhoods, education providers, justice systems, social and medical care. Some of that is happening now with moves towards more integrated healthcare models or the resourcing of community networks. But there are still many echoes of the belief that community problems are wicked problems, somehow so complex as to be intractable. Addiction recovery often sees crisis as a crucial moment for initiating change. For many communities, however, the crisis is not being hit by the next worst thing, but is the fact that the situation is already a structural endemic reality, that the severe impact of substance use on individuals, families, and communities is considered as almost normal, as accepted, as taken for granted. That's the crisis. Narrative therapy, narrative theory, the whole global piece, introduces the ideas of story and discourse, narratives that allow us to construct meaning. Community resilience, capacity, pride, toughness, and creativity are all narratives that have been sidelined in many cases, that have been dominated, whether by the omnipresence of substance use and its impact, or by structural processes, including governance. Today is about giving those thin stories a voice again, a voice of protest, a voice of hope, a voice of us together, a voice of community as a wounded healer. Communities into recovery has to start with us, however we fit into the system, being into recovery. And that must include looking at if and how we may be part of the problem. These conversations, honest and inclusive, are what will ultimately allow us weave together the patterns that serve communities, that create alliances, and that serve us recovery. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dermot. That was just a wonderful, I suppose, trying to match together what's going on in terms of, it was really good from David to hear a lot of emphasis on really understanding the individual recovery. And I think that really put it in the context of the next aspect of it, which is communities into recovery, and the fact that, you know, what I was saying about the responsibility of the community and also the responsibility of the state to communities. And I really felt that David talked quite a bit about community connectedness and how important that was for individuals. And I suppose you're really talking about that communities have structural challenges that need to be supported and addressed as well. So thank you very much. That was really lovely. I loved your piece about the voice of protest and the voice of hope coming to the forefront again.